My name is Dan Brotman, and I'm a passport nerd. Today, I'm going to be speaking about how to start thinking about alternative citizenships and residencies in 2026. I have the street cred. I'm originally from Boston, and my parents and grandparents only have one passport. However, I've spent the last 20 years outside of the US. I've lived in 5 countries, and during the course of my various stints abroad, I have picked up 3 additional citizenships. So I am a citizen of 4 countries. And I'm one of the few people in the investment migration industry who's formally studied the field. I did my master's in international immigration policy at the London School of Economics. And for me, migration is a very personal story. I'm Jewish, and during World War II, my people were trapped in Europe when no country wanted to take them. And there were not other options for them. The investment migration didn't exist. Uh, and you can see on the left here Jews lining up outside consulates in Vienna, desperate to get out of Europe. Most of them couldn't get papers to other countries, and they subsequently perished in the Holocaust. On the right, this is the infamous St. Louis. It was a ship that took over 900 mostly German Jewish refugees to Cuba. And while they were en route to Cuba, their visas were canceled. Cuba wouldn't allow most of them to disembark. They then tried to disembark in the US and Canada. Neither country would take them, and eventually they had to go back to Europe. And hundreds of them died in the Holocaust. And that was simply because they didn't have the option of settling in another country. They didn't have papers for somewhere else. Citizenship is a hierarchy. And based on your citizenship, you can enter certain countries or be prohibited from entering certain countries. Many of you are aware that since January 1st of this year, the US has an expanded travel ban list, and citizens of 75 countries have restrictions on entering the US. Some of these countries, their citizens cannot enter at all under any circumstance, and other ones only under a very limited scope of visas. But basically, if you're a citizen of one of these countries, it is either impossible or nearly impossible to enter the United States. But that may be different if you are a dual citizen and have a passport from a country other than one of the ones listed. And Americans aren't immune from this. So just like the US imposed a travel ban on 75 countries, some of those countries have reciprocated. And also, we shouldn't forget what happened during COVID. During COVID, the US passport became as weak as the Rwandan passport as countries barred citizens of certain parts of the world from entering, including Americans, based on the level of COVID in their country. So we take a US passport for granted as being a strong travel document that will always grant us mobility, but that is not always the case. Things can change very quickly. Also, you need a passport to get on an international flight. And the US recently announced that if there is a child support dispute or child support is owed as little as $2,500, your US passport can be revoked. And in addition, if you have a dispute with the IRS and the IRS says you owe at least $64,000, your passport can also be revoked. So again, you cannot get on an international flight without a passport. And once your passport is revoked, if you don't have another one, you are stuck within your country's borders. Very prominent people know that it's smart to diversify their mobility. And that's why we've seen recently in the news actors like George and Amal Clooney got French citizenship. Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, obtained Cypriot citizenship by investment during COVID when it was nearly impossible for Americans to enter Europe. And Peter Thiel obtained New Zealand citizenship, having only spent less than 2 weeks in the country. Again, I think what this also highlights is that countries have full discretion over who they grant citizenship to. So they can grant citizenship to people because they've lived in that country for a long time and they've passed certain tests. They can grant citizenship to people who they believe will make extraordinary economic contributions, like Peter Thiel, or just cultural figures that they want to be associated with, like George and Amal Clooney. This was a recent interview with Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater, and one of the most influential voices on global economic and geopolitical trends about what he sees happening in the US over the next few years. He said, as I look at the clock, we're going to come into the midterm elections, and I think that the Republicans will probably lose the House. I think that from that point on, you're going to see an intensification of political and social conflict that'll take place in that period, particularly between that election and the presidential election in 2028. His advice to people is that I think that the answer should be to know how to have a well diversified portfolio and that is largely balanced for these kinds of uncertainties. A well diversified portfolio isn't only financial, but it's also one's mobility. And it's important to remember that countries change. Just because your country is in a good situation now doesn't mean that it will be like that forever. On the left, this was Venezuela when the Concorde flew between Paris and Caracas. In 1970, Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America, and it was one of the 20 wealthiest countries in the world, even richer than Greece and Spain. And on the right, this is before the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, when Iran had one of the highest rates of female university enrollment in the Middle East. Countries can change. I think it's important to just define what is a temporary resident, a permanent resident, and a citizen, because people often get mixed up with the definitions. A temporary resident, and again, in the US, the equivalent of a temporary resident could, for example, be an H-1B visa holder. A temporary resident is allowed to stay in a country for a limited period of time for a very specific reason. So that could be for one's studies or for a specific job. And if the conditions change, like you finish your program and you're no longer enrolled, or you lose your job, your right to remain in the country may end. So it's very tied to a specific reason for a limited period of time. Permanent residency, and in the US, the equivalent would be a green card, allows you to live in a country indefinitely, provided that you continue meeting ongoing requirements. So that's usually related to how much time you spend in the country. And generally, it guarantees your right to re-enter the country. However, that's different than a citizen. And so on the far right, you see a US passport that belongs to a citizen. Citizenship grants full civic, political, and economic rights. So it means you can hold a passport, you can vote, you can run for public office, you're entitled to consular protection abroad. And you don't even have to live in the country. There's not a physical presence requirement generally to retain your citizenship. And again, unless you obtain your citizenship fraudulently, it's very, very difficult to revoke. It's as permanent a status as one can get. Citizenship is not the same as tax residency. There are only two countries in the world that tax their citizens on worldwide income, regardless of where they live. That's the US. The US taxes American citizens and green card holders, regardless of where in the world they're living. And Eritrea, which imposes a 2% diaspora tax on citizens living abroad. Besides for the US and Eritrea, tax residency is generally based on where you physically live and spend your time, rather than on the citizenship you hold. It's also important to remember that there is not a limitation on how many citizenships you can hold if you're an American or Canadian citizen. I took these screenshots directly off of the US and Canadian government websites. I'm a US and Canadian citizen, and I hold 4 passports. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that in law. So when people start to think about obtaining an alternative citizenship or residency, the very first thing they should do is look at their family tree, because your family tree will usually give you the quickest and least expensive route to another citizenship or residency. That can often be based on a parent, a grandparent, sometimes even a great-grandparent, or it could be based on your ethnicity or religion, depending on the country. However, the rules are constantly changing around ancestry. So, for example, Canada this past December changed their rules. And now, if you have any direct ancestor who was at one point Canadian and you were born before, I believe, December 15th, 2025, you could potentially be eligible for Canadian citizenship. Before, it only went up to 2 generations if you were born outside of Canada. Now there is no more generational limitation provided you were born before that date. So that became more liberal, more open, and millions of Americans are potentially now eligible for Canadian citizenship by ancestry. Italy is the opposite. Italy changed their law to make it much more restrictive. So Italy used to be more like what Canada is now. There wasn't necessarily a generational limit. And now there definitely is. It's only up to grandparent. And also, the citizenship cannot have been broken, meaning that if your grandparent naturalized, became a citizen in another country, that would have broken the chain. So far fewer Americans are now eligible for Italian citizenship by descent. But if they had just applied a few years ago, they would have been. And again, that's a perfect case in point for why, if you're eligible, get grandfathered in, because there is no knowing whether the rules are going to change. Um, if your family tree doesn't entitle you to another citizenship or residency, the next question would be, do you want to physically relocate? If you do want to physically relocate, you of course need to qualify for a residency permit to live in another country, and you should consult with an immigration lawyer in that country. But it's important to remember that when you obtain a residency permit in another country, generally that will make you a tax resident, and there will be a requirement to spend a substantial amount of time in that country in order to renew your status. So if you are willing to become a tax resident in that country and you're willing to spend a substantial part of the year in that country, then consulting an immigration lawyer would probably be the next best choice if you don't qualify through ancestry. If you don't qualify through your family tree and you don't want to physically relocate, but you still would like another citizenship or residency, the third route would be investment migration. Investment migration was actually pioneered in Canada. Over 200,000 primarily Chinese and Hong Kong or high net worth individuals came to Canada through a program that no longer exists, but it was called the Federal Immigrant Investor Program. It stopped in 2014. But basically, other countries saw what Canada was doing and said, we want to do the same thing. And they created their own programs. Investment migration is a regulated pathway to legal migration for high net worth individuals. It allows individuals to obtain citizenship or residency in exchange for making a qualifying investment or donation to the host country. And people do it for all types of reasons. Generally, it's because they want greater mobility. Either they want more better access to the world in terms of visa-free travel, or they're just maybe nervous about the situation in their home country and just want a plan B. But again, they don't want to move or become a tax resident in another country. They just want to have that plan B in their back pocket. Unlike traditional immigration, as I mentioned, investment migration programs typically don't require you to physically relocate to that country and become a tax resident, which is a huge advantage. And as part of the application, there's an extensive due diligence process where they look at your source of funds, criminal records, and really ensure that you're not going to bring their country into disrepute or be the type of person that they wouldn't want to grant residency or citizenship to. These are just examples. There's so many programs out there. I believe it's 80 countries in the world have some type of investment migration program. Some of them are temporary residency, permanent residency, and citizenship. They can be as low as $95,000 and go all the way up to over $1 million. So there's a whole variety of options that grant different levels of mobility. It's important to know, though, that the investment migration industry is not regulated. And so there are many unscrupulous players in the industry, and you should always really know who you're talking to. So there are three types of players. There's a licensed agent. A licensed agent is licensed by the government that has an investment migration program. And if you want to submit an application, you have to submit it through the licensed agent. You cannot submit directly to the government. So they prepare your file, they submit it to the government. Then there's a marketing agent. A marketing agent has an agreement with the licensed agent and with the government, but they're not submitting your file for you. So you're speaking to a marketing agent. They'll tell you about all the different types of programs that they market. They'll advise you on the best program, and then they will basically outsource your application to the licensed agent, which will put it together and then submit it to the government. And then the third type of player you may speak to is a referral agent or an introducer. They are not licensed. They might have an agreement with the marketing agent, and they simply make an introduction and receive a fee if the introduction leads to a successful application. Then that will go to the marketing agent, which will then also take a cut, and then which will go to the licensed agent to put your application together, and they also get a cut. So that's three layers of commission and middlemen. So I always say, if you know exactly which investment migration program you want, you can go directly to the licensed agent. It cuts out all the middlemen, and it may be less expensive because there won't be so many layers of commission. If you're not sure what you want, then it could be smart to go to a marketing agent because they are licensed to market many programs and can really talk you through the pros and the cons of the various programs, whereas the licensed agent only specializes in, maybe a couple of countries that they're licensed directly through the government. I'm more than happy to speak to people about how to start thinking about second citizenships and residencies. The best way to get in touch with me is on LinkedIn, Dan Brotman. And just remember that if you qualify for a particular route now, get grandfathered in because this space is changing all the time and the direction it's going in is only becoming more restrictive.